Hi, good morning. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm really appreciative of how many of you are here today to talk about this important stuff. So a little bit about me. You can probably hear I'm not Californian native. I was born in England and grew up there, and I've been in America now for 16 years. I'm just back from a trip, and the steward I was talking to asked me where I was from, and he was British. And so while I sound British to you, I don't apparently sound British to them anymore. I'm the associate pastor at Hollywood United Methodist Church, and that's a 3/4 time position. I'm also the LGBTQIA+ advocacy coordinator for the conference. That's a new position that has just been created with the results of the Special Court General Conference and the Judicial Council. And my role is to provide information, assistance, help those difficult conversations that we need to be having, and to make sure that LGBT people have a voice in the conference, because even though we are in a very open and affirming conference, there has been a lack of visibility of LGBT people at many things. Like conference last year, there was 3 conversations that people had on the stage about their experience with LGBT people. Not one of them was queer. They were all cisgender heterosexual people, and it's time we change that and make sure that everybody has a voice and is represented. So that's part of my new roles. I also run, Matt, if you can go a couple of slides ahead. Thank you. I have started a group called Spectrum. It's an interfaith youth group. It runs in Hollywood at the LGBT Center. It's for kids of any faith who identify as queer in any way in the spectrum to be able to come and talk and have conversations about where God is and how their sexuality or gender identity intersects with that. So it's been slow getting going because there's been so much harm done by the church, and so these kids are a little bit angsty and coming to talk to me, but we're getting there and we're getting more interest and people are starting to listen. So, okay, next slide. Oh, you've done it already, good. So why am I here? Well, the Special General Conference and the Judicial Council have made some changes to the legislation of the United Methodist Church, which strengthen the laws and the rules against LGBT people within our church. And because of that, we need to try and find out where we're going to go. And what does that mean for us as a conference? What are we going to do? How are we going to go from what steps are we going to take from this place on? As I told you, I'm associate pastor at Hollywood United Methodist Church. Probably 45% of that church identify somewhere on the queer spectrum. That's a lot of people. I myself am a lesbian, and for me, being a pastor to people who look like me and them having a pastor who looks like them is a very powerful experience. It enables me to be fully authentic myself and enables them to be able to see themselves in the form of leadership in the church. And I've got some stories of some people that have been so badly hurt by the church. Matt is a member of our church who grew up in the South, and when he was 9 years old knew that he was gay and went to church, and the pastor at the church at that time told him that God sent AIDS to kill all the gay people. So he thought he'd never grow up. He spent his whole formative years thinking that somehow he was going to die before he became an adult. He didn't, but he did leave the church. Later on, he went on and got married to a Jewish man, and they adopted some children. And they decided, because of the church's stance, that they were going to raise their children Jewish. But Matt felt a pull to have his children at least see his religion and his faith and how it worked. So he did some research and he came to Hollywood, brought his kids along. And it happened to be a day that I was preaching. And his words to me afterwards was, he said, "I never thought in my life that I would come to a church and see a lesbian with purple hair standing in the pulpit telling me that God loves me." He's actually a filmmaker, and he's gone on to make a short documentary that's going to be at Sundance this year about his experience with the church and how he's come back to it and is able to volunteer and work on the missions of our church. Similar story from a guy called Tim, who grew up in the church, being told that being gay was a sin and that God didn't love him, and he got a brain tumor when he was 13 and thought it was because he was gay, and that was God's way of killing him because he was gay. He has no family members now that will speak with him. They come from Iowa, I think. It's Iowa. And he has no contact with his family at all. So the church has become his family and his community, and is a very big part of his life. And it's these people and the dozens and dozens more that I can tell you about that make up our church community that we have to stop doing this harm to. We have to stop hurting these children and barring them from our churches and not letting them know that they are loved. So that's why I'm here, and that's what we're going to talk to you about today. We're going to cover a bunch of things. We're going to talk about language. Language changes so quickly, so I'm going to tell you what the language is today. It might be different tomorrow, but I'm also going to tell you where you can go to find out where the information is changing. Then we're going to look at some of the statistics of LGBT youth and young adults, how we go about creating a safe environment. We're going to talk a little bit about coming out, and we're going to talk about how to build a support document within your settings for LGBT youth, young adults, and other adults too. So moving on to language, we're going to unlock the alphabet soup, right? This acronym gets longer and longer and longer each time. And that's why I say queer, because it's much easier than saying LGBTQIA+, and still worrying that I'm missing out somebody. So we're going to have a look at that and what it means and how we can use that language to be inclusive in everything that we do. So we're going to break that down into 5 different areas. There we go. We're going to look at, I can't read my notes on there, so I'm going up to here. Some useful terms. We're going to look at some gender terms, some sexual orientation terms, where we use them and how we use them. All right? So, first of all, useful terms. All right? The first one on there is an ally. What is an LGBTQ ally? It's somebody who is supportive of anybody who identifies on the queer spectrum, but who does not identify on that spectrum as well. And the most important thing about being an ally is that it's not a noun, it's a verb. So you've got to do something with it. Just saying I support people is not enough, right? You've got to go out there and be active and show how you are supportive of them. Closeted is probably a term most people know, is somebody who keeps a part of their identity hidden for whatever reason that may be. Coming out is the process of finding out who you are and accepting who you are and then sharing that with other people. And then there's this other term which you may not have heard, which I far prefer, and that's inviting in. I prefer it because when you come out, you're giving of yourself to other people. If you invite people in, you're sharing your story and you're in control. So it's a much softer and more gentle term, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how to use that a bit later on. Okay, there's some other terms here. So gender. What is gender? It's traditionally been a binary thing, male or female, but we use gender to say who we are in terms of social and cultural placements of those two terms. Your gender identity is your innermost concept of who you are. So if you present as a woman and you're born as a woman, then you're said to be cisgendered, right? It's who you believe you are and what you look like and what biologically you are too. Your gender expression is how you express yourself in terms of your clothes, your hair, the way you walk, your stance, the language you use. That's your gender expression. Your sex is the biological status that was assigned to you at birth. And we'll talk a bit more about intersex and what that means a bit later on. Agender is people who don't identify with any gender or gender identity. Now, we only have 2 descriptors for gender, so if you don't feel you identify with either male or female, then you're agender. Bigender is people who change their identity, so it's more of a fluid thing and they can change from one to the other. And cisgender is people who present as their biological sex and how they feel inside. So that is cisgender. You'll hear that term used quite a lot. Cross-dressing. So cross-dressing is a cisgender person, so somebody who identifies with how they present biologically, who dresses in the clothes of the opposite sex. As opposed to dressing in drag, which is where people dress up just for the sake of a performance. So they're not transgender, they're not cross-dressing, they're dressing to fulfill a function like a role that they have fun with. Gender fluid is people who move in and out of the two different binary forms of gender, mostly on a day-by-day basis, but sometimes more than that. And then genderism is a prejudice against transgender people. As opposed to being afraid of them, it's a prejudice against them, and those two are different. Genderqueer is an expression used to identify people who don't identify as male or female. So there's something else that we don't have a word for. And intersex. So people whose sex characteristics are not clearly defined. So some people are born intersex, and they have both sets of organs. And very often, traditionally, parents have made the choice for that person at birth. And surgery is done to make that person one gender or the other. And what we're finding more and more and more is very often that the parents didn't make the choice that the person would have made for themselves. So they have a very particular identifying part within the alphabet soup. And non-binary are people who don't identify with either male or female. They could be agender, or they could be somewhere in the middle of those two expressions. I had a phone call at church the other day from a gentleman whose question was, why did God make gay people and transgender people? That's a huge question at lunchtime to have to answer on the telephone. But what I said to him was, God made man in God's image and God made woman in God's image, and on that whole spectrum there's a line from one to the other, right? And there can be any kind of expression along that line in terms of fully male or fully female or somewhere in the middle. And we only have words for those two at the end. We don't have words for the whole thing in the middle. He seemed to like that. I won't tell you what his response, because I'm not saying that word in church, but he liked what I had to say. So transgender are people whose psychological and spiritual sense of gender differs from the socially acceptable norm for them, and transsexual are people who identify to the opposite sex to that which they are assigned at birth. And people are in transition are people that are going through surgery and hormonal replacement to alter their identity to the one they feel they identify with more. Transphobia is the irrational fear of transgender persons. And this is one of my favourite terms. Two-spirit is a Native American term for anybody who doesn't identify as cisgender, heterosexual. I just think that's a lovely way of expressing it. They've used that term for very many years, and to identify anybody like that, and I just think that's a beautiful expression. Okay, language, pronouns. Pronouns are one of those really tricky things, right? Because we're so brought up to be he's and she's, but if people don't identify with that, then they want to use something else to describe them. So these are a list of some of the common ones that are used today. So obviously she, her, hers, herself, we all know he, him, his, himself, we know. They, them, theirs, themselves, we know, but that's tricky when people want to use they in the singular. If you are one of those grammar police, then you really struggle with using they for individuals. So they came up with these other two, z, zir, ziz, and zirself, and I, am, er, self, as a way of being able to maybe help people with that exercise. And then, of course, the last option is to use somebody's name and just use their name. So this is something that people really struggle with. I find it difficult to get it right, and people are kind of scared of doing it. So, have a little exercise for you. Awesome. Thank you so much for participating in that. How did you find it? not so scary as you think it might be first of all. And you know, the more you practice, the easier it gets. And if you get it wrong, it's no big deal. You can just apologize and move on. The fact that you're trying is what's important, right? Is you're making the effort to appreciate and affirm who people are. All right, let's move on a little. So we're looking at orientation now as opposed to gender identity. And we've got asexual, a person who doesn't experience sexual attraction in any kind. Doesn't mean they're celibate, because that's a choice. It just means that they don't have that attraction to other people. Bisexual are people who experience sexual and emotional attraction to both men and women. And gay is a blanket term for same-sex attraction, but it's generally used in terms of men more than women. And then we have heterosexual, people who are sexually and emotionally attracted to the opposite sex, right, the other end of the norm. And heterosexism is prejudice against anybody who's not heterosexual. And homophobia is the irrational fear of those who are not heterosexual. Homosexual is a historical term used to describe both gay and lesbian people. It's interestingly now is the term that's really only ever used when in theological debates about sexuality. Homosexual is very rarely used outside of those kind of discussions. Lesbian are women who experience sexual and emotional attraction to other women. And somebody who is pansexual are people who experience sexual or affectional attraction to people of any gender identity or sex. Queer, anyone who lives outside the heterosexual gender norms. Now this is one of those words that historically was used against people who don't identify as cisgender heterosexual, but has also been reclaimed in later time. So my generation, for instance, being called queer was not a good thing, and yet I now describe myself as queer. However, it is one of those push-button words that for some people is very problematic, so we do have to be careful. Same-gender loving is a bit like that two-spirit thing, you know, but that's the African-American contextual word for gay and lesbian people. And straight obviously means heterosexual and gender conforming. So, where can we use all these words that we're learning? There's all different places we can make a start with, and those are things like application forms that we use in our churches, right? If people apply to become a member or to send their child on a youth camp, let's put gender orientation on there. You know, instead of having sex as male or female, let's put gender orientation on there. Just one little thing that makes a huge wealth of difference to somebody. In our bulletins and around and talking in any publications that we make and any meetings that we have, try and use some of this language instead of the traditional God is he type language. Let's try and use something a bit different. And then in your everyday language. So it's like anything, when you learn a new language, you're going to get it wrong and it's going to be difficult, but the more you use it, the more natural it becomes. And so just keep trying to use it wherever you can. Okay, so next one, Matt, please. Oh, yeah.
One of the other language ones that was used often within the transgender community, especially when parents are talking about their kids, is assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. You might see AMAB or AMAB.
Oh, that's great, thank you.
It's one of those things that it can be common when parents are talking about their kids who are transgender. So maybe something you might want to know.
Yes, that's great. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate that. Okay, so as I said, this language keeps changing because it's a new thing and it's something we're becoming more and more aware of and more accepting of. And so keep up to date with, there are various publications that keep you informed on this. And actually I have a list of websites and books that I'll give you afterwards that can help you keep informed and up to date with what's going on. And don't be scared, right? The very fact that you're trying is enough. And it shows people that you're making an effort, you're recognizing them and seeing them for who they are. And that's really, really affirming for people. And ask. If you don't know, ask. It's better to ask than get it wrong. So may I ask you what words you use to describe yourself? Or may I ask you what those words mean to you? Because, like I said, it changes, and it could be that different generations use different words to mean different things. And the worst thing of all, of course, is to be silent and not speak out, all right? And not ask and not use the language, because that is, in effect, shutting the door. So use it. Don't be scared to use it. Okay. So there's a few statistics that I want you to be aware of. This is from a Human Rights Campaign survey that was done in 2018. And the first one tells us that 42% of LGBT youth say that the community in which they're living is not affirming or accepting of LGBT people. 42% of LGBT kids. And then the next one is that LGBT youth are twice as likely to say they've been physically assaulted or bullied than their heterosexual cisgender peers. 26% of LGBT youth say their biggest problems are not being accepted by their family or their peers or their churches, and that they're bullied at school, whereas 22% of non-LGBT youth say their biggest problems are trouble with grades, exams and homework. All right, so they're concentrating on what they should be concentrating on and not having to have this extra pressure of being bullied. Almost 3/4 of LGBT youth say they're most honest about themselves online than they are in the real world, which is an interesting statistic when you think about it, because most of us are not honest about ourselves online, right? We portray this amazing, fantastic, wonderful life that we have that everybody should be jealous of, but these kids, the only place they can be honest is online. 75% of LGBT youth say that most of their peers don't have a problem with their identity. And 92% of LGBT youth say they hear negative messages about being LGBT. 92%. The top sources are school, the internet, and their peers. And I think it should say, and their church, their faith also on there. 2/3 of high school youth say they're out to their classmates. And 68% of LGBT youth say they hear negative messages about being LGBT from their elected leaders. And that number is rising significantly every month. LGBT youth out to their immediate families are more likely to report being happy than those who are not. So all of this is to really identify that LGBT youth face problems that cisgender heterosexual youth do not. And they have added stresses and strains which work towards the mental health issues that we're finding so many people, youth and young adults, are experiencing at that time. So how do we create a safe environment for these kids so that they can come and feel safe and be who they should be? And these are some of the ways. And we're still learning, and it's changing all the time, but the language used, right? To be able to use this language makes it something that's acceptable and not a taboo subject. So if they hear it being used in and around the environments they're in, they're going to feel safer and they're going to trust. And if they hear that non-gender specific language to describe God and each other and to make those different options, then it's going to be a much safer and easier path for them. Make the activities varied and inclusive. So don't do sport games and have boys on one side and girls on the other, because where do the transgender kids go then? Immediately there's a problem for those kids. So don't separate them by gender. And this came up last night a bit, and it came up at a camp I was at recently. What do we do about overnights, right, when we've got transgender kids in the room? It's tricky. We are organised and use safe gatherings as our child protection stuff, and it's a good system and it teaches people well, but it doesn't have anything in it for transgender people. There are no rules and regulations, and this is something I'm going to be bringing up with Bishop Grant next week when I see him about we need to create a policy now for transgender kids in our camps. So we did a confirmation retreat at Hollywood a few months ago, and there was 3 or 4 different churches that came, and there was a transgender youth in there. So we all slept together in one room. We didn't have boys in one room and girls in the other. We had all the staff and all the kids all together in one room. And we kept them so busy that all they were going to do was go to sleep at night. At Lazy W, I was there just recently, and these were young adults, so it's slightly different because we don't have to be so concerned about where they're sleeping. But somebody had signed up who identified as non-binary. So the camp counselors were all having a conniption about what do we do about sleeping, you know. So I said to them, well, how about you do a boys' dorm, a girls' dorm, and we don't care what you are dorm. So that's what they did. And there were people that were comfortable to sleep in that, we don't care what you are dorm. But they were adults, they were young adults, so it was slightly different. But I was talking with the director of that camp, and they have 2 or 3 transgender youth that come to their camps every year. So what they do is they have a boys' dorm, they have a girls' dorm, and then they have a non-specific dorm. And what they do is they write to the parents of the kids that they know, and then they know don't have a problem, and they say, would you be prepared for your child to sleep in this cabin? So they've got around it by dealing with that, and most of these parents are fine with it and not a problem. But it is something we're going to have to work on and something we're going to have to figure out in the near future. Right. That's the other thing that's really important. Your gender identity and your sexuality are not all of who you are, you know. It's all these other things that make up each and every one of us. And they're all as important, if not more important. So remember that, you know. Just because a kid comes out to you doesn't mean that that's all you ever have to talk about with that kid. All right? They're still a kid and they're still learning and doing all this other stuff too. And role models. Have people who look like the kids in leadership roles within the church so that they see themselves represented. I did a talk at San Dieguito UMC last weekend, and we had 70 young people from across San Diego who came to that talk. And after I got home, there was another seminary friend there actually who had brought her young people, and she texted me and she said, you have just changed the world for one of my kids. She's a 14-year-old lesbian, and she said she has never before seen somebody in church stand up and say, I'm a lesbian and I'm gay and God loves me and God loves all of you too. And she said representation matters. You know, that kid, for her to see me up there was such a big deal because she'd never seen anything like it before. So have those people in those positions. And we're going to talk a little bit about coming out. And I got a couple of video clips which we'll play in a minute. But first of all, I prefer much the inviting in language. So we're not giving of ourselves, we're inviting people into our story. And it's really important. So let's do the first video clip. Makes me cry every time I watch that. So that's the way to be. When somebody invites you into their story and they're part of who you are, those kind of loving responses. And the reason they're so important for youth and young adults is because they are going through so much change already. Their brains are redeveloping, they're rewiring their brains, they're learning about independence, they're learning to think for themselves and not what you have always told them to think. They're reforming, and rejection at this point could harm them for the rest of their lives. And rejection from parents and from churches and from other institutions is doing so much harm and so much damage. So being able to share an experience like that and then maybe say to them, Who else would you like to invite into your story? Is such a much more beautiful and open and loving way to respond to that. So, yeah. As we said before, it's everything about their world, not just their sexuality, but their sexuality and gender identity have become such a big thing in our society and culture that it's really important to them. This was an interesting... No, go back. Thank you. The average ages for expressing a sexuality other than the norm really vary widely, but this trend is really interesting. For millennials, the average age is 17. But for people who are now over 60, the average age was 37. And for people who are 75 and older, it was 49. So that's a huge, huge change. And something we really need to be aware of. And it's such a crucial time in their lives, as I said. And here's something else that's really important. Who are their family? Right? What are the dynamics of their family? How is this going to play out with them? And as youth workers or people that work with young people, we need to be aware of that. Who are their friends? Who's going to support them? Who's going to give them a hard time? And how can we help in that? And support the family too. It's not just the young person that's going through this, it's the family too. And it's hard for parents. I was sharing with somebody last night who had the same experience I had, which was that his mum said to him, "It's fine and I love you, but it's not the life I would have chosen for you." And my mother said very similar words to me. And the reason they said them is because it's hard, right? You're not going to have this easy life of getting married and having babies and doing everything that society expects you to do. And so it's not what a parent would wish for their child. A terrifying statistic for me, 40% of the 1.6 million homeless youth in the US identify as queer, and that's the reason that they're homeless. The LGBT Centre in West Hollywood has just built a new building with 100 rooms for homeless LGBT youth and 100 rooms for homeless LGBT seniors, because those are the two ends of the spectrum where homelessness is really, really much affected. All right, next one, Matt. Here's the thing, right? So don't leave. Encourage and affirm them and talk to them and be open to it, but it's their story, not yours. So you can encourage them to talk more and explore more and question more, but it's not your story. And include others. You don't have to do all this by yourself. It takes a village. For each and every one of us, it takes a village, so don't feel you've got to do this alone. And for that, we move on to building a support document. This is a really important resource for churches and youth groups, a document that contains details of what's in the community, what support systems are there around. Matt, if you could move on, that'd be great. In the community that you can rely on. So, suicide, sadly, is one of the largest problems with LGBT communities. I've done 3 different suicide attempts this year of youth and young adults who have attempted suicide because of their sexuality. The Trevor Project and the Trans Lifeline are both organisations that can help you. Homelessness. Did you know that most homeless shelters are not LGBT friendly, and that the LGBT community are bullied and put out of these because they're LGBT, of most regular shelters? So find out which are the shelters in the area that are LGBT friendly. Find therapists that are affirming, because we're not everything and we can't be everything for all these kids. So we need to find people that we can refer them onto and get them the help that they need, the professional help. So find out which therapists in the area are affirming. And which family support centres, where's the nearest LGBT centre, and and develop a relationship with them. Is there PFLAG? Do you know what PFLAG is? It's the parents of children who are non-cisgender heterosexual, and it's a support group that meets and does amazing work. Many churches have PFLAGs that meet on their premises. Local schools and colleges very often have gay-straight alliances. Most schools do. Find out who they are, get in touch with them and what they do, make a relationship with them. And then social services, find out who your local licensed clinical social worker is, and have all that information ready, so that if something happens, you can at least hand it to parents or to young people and say, this is here for you and this is what we can do to help. So So, I've talked for far too long and far too much. Any questions anybody has? Yeah.
Would you be willing to send us your PowerPoint?
Sure. I'll send it to Matt. Or I have your email address. Yeah, no problem. I'll send it without the video clips, however. Yeah.
This isn't really a question, but in case you're unaware, in San Diego, we do have an excellent gay and lesbian center, and they have all the services that are needed. Got them on that chart. You can find resources for every single one of those in San Diego.
Great. There you go, Matt. There's your support document. Alrighty.
Including a teen shelter. So if you,
Right.
so there is, I mean, I think they're waiting us to get in because that's a huge problem, but there is a homeless teen shelter specifically for queer youth
Wonderful.
in San Diego.
Wonderful. Matt.
So, I have sent students over to the LGBT Center that have done some incredible things, and I wanted to do, I heard you say, make a connection, but I have to admit, like, every time I think about that, I always think, how am I going to tell them that I'm not one of those pastors? Like, how do I make that clear?
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? Especially now, right? I was in a coffee shop in San Diego last week getting ready to go down there and make my speech, and I met this couple and we got talking, and they asked me if I was on vacation or what I was there for, and I told them I was a pastor, and they said, oh, what church are you a pastor at? And I said, oh, United Methodist. And they said, oh, I'm sorry. We have a bad rap right now. And this, Matt, is exactly the problem I'm having at the LGBT Centre. The only way you can show it is by your actions. By being involved, by not going away, by sharing your beliefs on the Bible, and what the Bible says about homosexuality, by being armed with that defense, and by constantly showing up and loving them. That's how you do it. Now, there's a thing called Life Touch at my LGBT Centre in Hollywood, and that's a mentoring program for LGBT youth. It's kind of like that Big Brother thing. I don't know what it's called, but you know, it's kind of like that. Yeah. So they take the kids out. You commit to spending a couple of hours a week with your assigned young person, and then they have like day trips to the beach where you all go together. And it's just to provide, and they're looking for straight people to do that. So, you know, a lot of people from my church do that, and that's another way to start building that relationship, because these kids, that all of a sudden they're like, oh, you go to church? Hang on. It doesn't add up, so they start to ask questions. Any more?
What do you think the way forward is for the United Methodist Church?
Oh, there's a big question. So what is the way forward for the United Methodist Church? Right now, I don't know. I'm in a really unique position in that I'm commissioned but not ordained. And I am the only out queer person who's eligible for ordination next year. And the way the new rules are is I can't be ordained because they took out the practicing part of the self-avowed practicing homosexual. So now if you've ever publicly declared that you are not cisgender heterosexual, then you can't be ordained in the church. And I was on the front page of the LA Times a few weeks ago, and it said, Reverend Denyse who is gay, so I'm out. So I talked with the bishop about this, because obviously I was concerned about what was going to happen now. He's very fired up and very angry, and very keen to move forward. His words to me were, if we haven't left by then, because obviously they'll ordain me in this conference, there's no problem with that, but it's very likely that I'll be ordained on Saturday, and by Sunday there'll be charges brought against me. So he said to me, if that happens and those charges are brought and we're still in, we will leave at that point. Those were his words to me, which are very reassuring to me. But we can't just leave, right? We have to have a plan. We're part of this global organization, and somehow they have to extricate themselves, or we do. Because I think it's too far down the line now for us to all be under one roof together. So there are some groups that are meeting. There's a group meeting in Minneapolis next week or the week after called Forward. That's a group of people that are getting together to talk about what ways are there to go forward. And then there's a group meeting directly after that, that's called UN Next, and that's led by the Reverend Adam Hamilton, who is part of the biggest church we have in Kansas City. And they're collecting 10 people from each conference to go to this meeting. So there'll be over 600 people there, and there's 10 bishops that are going, and I'm going. I got an invite to go, so I'm going to be part of that conversation, which is, what are the options and how do we make them happen? So there's a lot of hurry up and wait right now, but there is stuff happening. Once we've had those conversations, we will come back and we will start disseminating that information and getting what do people want? What does this new church look like? I have a very clear view of what this new church is going to be like, and I'm actually very excited to be a part of it and what we can make. And I keep promising people that it's going to be full of glitter and rainbows and butterflies. I don't know if the bishop agrees with me on that one, but we'll see. But so it's a really exciting time, right? We can finally be a church that really is based on John Wesley's attitudes of inclusion and not exclusion. We won't be the church that excluded women, that excluded black people, that split over slavery. We can't keep doing that. And I'm co-chair of the LGBT task force, and our mission statement is that wherever we go and whatever we do, we have to build a church where this doesn't happen to those that come behind us, right? So we've done slavery, we've done people of color, we've done gay people, we've done women. There'll be more, because there always is. What we have to do is make sure that whatever church we build from here on in doesn't do that. Right? We show that we are inclusive and affirming of everybody. We are all God's beloved children, and we all have a place at the table. And interestingly, somebody said to me the other day, John Pavlovitz, who's an author and activist, said to me, that's fine that we're saying that, but we have to really live that out. So those people that are now saying that I'm not worthy and I'm an abomination, am I prepared to invite those people to my table? Because that's what we're going to have to do in order to be able to move forward and grow as a church. So I don't know is the answer to your question, but there is exciting things happening, and there is a way forward. Yeah.
How do you confront people who disagree with all of this, like don't want to include them? Like how do you talk to them and confront them?
So I think one of the biggest things, the biggest pieces of advice is to get to know them, right? We are a relational people. We have relationships with each other, with our families, with God. It's all about relationships. And it's really hard to be against somebody when you have a relationship with them. So before I was appointed to Hollywood, I was a member of Ojai, United Methodist Church. You guys know where Ojai is, right? Yeah. And that's a pretty rich, white, conservative area. And I started to feel a call and to answer that call, and I started to preach there. And the first few times I preached, people would get up and leave because I was gay. And I'm a bit cussed in that I'm fine if you don't like me, but you have to know me before you make that decision, right? So I made it my task with this group of 3 or 4 women to really get to know them and to develop a relationship with them. So one had a couple of kids that she'd adopted, so I would take the kids out and I got to know the kids, and therefore she got to know me through them. One had a dog, and I had 5 dogs, so I would take dog cookies over. And gradually, every event we had, you'd find me in the corner with those ladies. I mean, they didn't want me there, but I was there getting to know them and letting them get to know me. 6 months later, I took Ojai through the reconciling process, and they became a reconciling church. And then I got my assignment to go to Hollywood to do my internship. So I took a little group of these women out for lunch and told them, because I knew that by the end of the day, the whole church would know that I was going. And the very first phone call I got to say, don't go, we're going to miss you, was one of those women. So it's about relationship, and it's about showing them the beloved child of God in you, but seeing the beloved child of God in them. Because these people don't have these feelings of hate just because. They truly believe that what they believe is right, just as we truly believe that what we believe is right. So we have to show them in other ways, and we have to show them what it is to be in a loving relationship, and the fruits of the Spirit are in all of us, so that they can get to see that.
We have a couple of teenagers at home, and
Right, exactly. So it's like I said, it's that they're reforming and making their own decisions. And there's a brilliant book, and it's on my list, and she also has YouTube videos by a friend of mine called Kathy Baldock. And she does this incredible presentation. She was raised evangelical, traditional, had very clear views on homosexuality, and after she got divorced from her husband, she took up hiking. And she would be hiking in Nevada, and she met this woman, and they became firm friends and hiking buddies. And for a year, they hiked together and changed the world, as they hiked. And after a year, this woman told her that she was a lesbian. And Kathy was like, what? Wait, no, that can't be true. I really like this woman. I see God in this woman. I know that she's living a good, faithful Christian life. How can that be? And it totally changed her world. And she has now researched since the beginning of when we stopped being nomadic and became tribal people, how homosexuality has been treated by the church, by society and culture, and by science. So you walk in the room when she's doing a presentation, and literally around the entire room are timelines which show the significant events that have happened over time, and how the different areas have influenced each other. She discovered that the word homosexual was never even in the Bible until 1939. The word didn't even exist until 1932 when the Germans invented it. The word was put in the Bible by an American man who was homeschooling his children and didn't like the translation of the Bible that he was using, so made his own. And he was very anti-LGBT, so he put the word homosexual in. So she's done all this research and found out how we've all influenced each other so much. So that's a really good place to start. And probably watch. It's a 90-minute YouTube video that she has as a summary. Might be a really good place to start to explain what we've done wrong all these years and how we're looking to change it now.
I really like what Adam Hamilton said in his book about what the Bible says, and he has a whole chapter on homosexuality.
Yeah, so I have a lot of different books that have been, there's tons of different books that have been written on this, but I think what we lost along the way was understanding how culture changes over time, and what was written for a culture over 2,000 years ago, right? It's not the same anymore. We have a different understanding, we have more knowledge, and so we have to, when we read the Bible, we have to understand the context it's written in, and how we can then apply that to our context. And just very briefly, Kathy Baldock in all her research found out that the two words that have been used to substitute for homosexuality were arsenikoi and malakoi, and those are actually two words that we don't have translations for, so nobody really knows what they mean. But what they did find was a list of sins that Paul had made, and they're in two different columns, and there's like sins against humanity and humankind, and then there's economic sins. And these two words were in the list of economic sins. They weren't in the list of human sins. And so what we think they mean is relationships where there's an imbalance of power, right, are not right. So priests and altar boys, right? There's not a balance of power in that relationship. So therefore it shouldn't happen, as opposed to it being two men. So, yeah, there's a ton of different research and things you can read about it, and I'll give you the list of resources. But it makes very interesting reading. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and your interest. I left my cards out there if you've got any questions you want to get in touch. I'm going to collect those.